A man ties himself to a standing stone. He is already dying. A spear has gone through him, low and mortal, and he knows it, and his enemies know it too, watching from a safe distance because even now, gut-wounded and failing, none of them want to be the one who gets close enough to find out he isn't finished yet. He has spent his entire adult life being the exception to every rule that should have killed him already, and even his enemies, waiting at a distance with their weapons still drawn, seem to understand that a man like this doesn't simply stop being dangerous the moment he falls. So he does the only thing left that's still his to decide. He walks to the stone. He binds himself upright with his own belt so that whatever happens next he will not die lying down. He will die facing them. Hours pass, maybe longer. Nobody can tell if he's still breathing. His eyes don't close, his sword doesn't fall. A strange light, the one that has burned around him in every battle of his life, still flickers faintly at his brow. His enemies wait. They have fought this man for years, lost countless companions to him at fords and in single combat, and not one of them is willing to be the one who steps forward first, in case the light at his brow means he is not, in fact, finished. And then a bird lands on his shoulder, just a crow, black, ordinary, the kind that would have been circling any battlefield in Iron Age Island looking for exactly what it's about to find. It settles on him the way a bird settles on a fence post, unhurried, untroubled, entirely at home. Only then do his enemies approach. The bird is how they know he's dead, not the wound, not the silence. A crow deciding it's safe to land is treated as more reliable evidence of a hero's death than the eyes of the men who spent a career trying to kill him. That crow is not a coincidence, and it is not really a bird. Irish tradition has a name for what just landed on that dying man's shoulder, and by the time this story's over, that same figure will have offered him her love, attacked him in 3 different animal shapes, tricked him into healing her with his own hands, and now, finally, arrived to confirm the ending she may have known was coming since the moment he turned her down. She's usually filed under Goddess of War. That's true, and it is also almost nothing. Tonight we're finding out what got left out. Long before the standing stone there was a river ford, and a young woman standing beside it, who had no obvious business being there. The hero's name was Cú Chulainn, the Hound of Ulster, barely out of boyhood by the reckoning of his own sagas, already the only thing standing between his homeland and an invading army come to steal a bull. Ulster's grown warriors were incapacitated by a curse that struck at the worst possible moment. A debt laid on the entire province generations earlier by a wronged woman named Macha, who does not enter this story yet, but whose name is worth holding on to because before this video is finished you'll learn exactly what she was owed and why she made an entire nation of men pay for it at the one moment it could least afford to. Cú Chulainn was exempt from her curse. Divine blood ran on his father's side, so the entire war fell to him alone. Single combats at the ford, day after day, a one-man siege against however many champions Queen Maeve of Connaught cared to send. Into the middle of that came the woman at the ford, young, beautiful, unnamed to him, offering exactly what an exhausted, outnumbered warrior might reasonably want: her love and, depending on which version of the story you're reading, her help in the fight ahead. He refused her, bluntly, dismissively according to the oldest tellings, a young man too consumed with holding a border by himself to have any patience left for a stranger's offer, whoever she turned out to be. She did not take it well. She told him in essence that she would be there when he fought next, not beside him, against him. He had just turned down help from a figure his own culture would have recognised as far more than a woman at river. In the sagas that supply the backstory to this exact confrontation, the Tónbo Rechgam Nu, the foretale that sets the whole conflict in motion, this is established as no ordinary encounter. It's a warning shot from someone whose favour a hero should never have refused. She made good on the threat. Almost immediately, and she did it with a level of craft that should tell you this was never really about a spurned advance. At the ford mid-combat, Cú Chulainn felt something coil around his leg and pull. An eel, thick and sudden, tripping him in the water while he was supposed to be watching an opponent instead. Not a natural creature acting on natural instinct, but something with intent behind it, timed to the exact moment his footing mattered most. He recovered, drove it off, wounded it badly enough that the injury would matter later. Then came the cattle. A wolf, not a natural one either, moving with too much purpose, too much aim, drove a stampede straight toward him across the ford, forcing him to fight for his footing instead of the battle he was actually there for. Dozens of animals driven by something that wanted him trampled rather than simply beaten. He struck the wolf too, hard enough to blind an eye. Then a hornless heifer, red-eared, white-hided, a very specific, almost ceremonial description for an animal that exists in the story purely to hurt one man, leading yet another charge of cattle directly at him. He broke its leg with a stone from his sling. 3 attacks, 3 animal forms, each one interrupting him at the exact moment he could least afford the distraction. 3 wounds delivered by a warrior who had no idea, in the moment, that he was fighting the same figure 3 separate times, and who would, each time, walk away from the encounter having hurt her, without ever once seeing her face. This is where a simpler telling of this story stops. Vengeful goddess, humiliated hero, 3 rounds of supernatural harassment as payback for an insult, and it isn't wrong exactly. But it also isn't finished, because the story doesn't end with the 3rd wound. It ends with her walking back into his life on purpose, in a form he wouldn't recognise, and asking the man who'd hurt her for something only he could give her. After the fighting was done, after Cú Chulainn had defeated whatever human opponent the 3 animal ambushers had been trying to distract him from, he came across an old woman, milking a cow by the roadside. Ordinary, unthreatening. Exactly the kind of figure a battle-weary young hero wouldn't look at twice. She was injured, an eye clouded over, a leg that didn't sit right, wounds that, if you'd been paying very close attention to an eel, a wolf, and a heifer a few hours earlier, you might have recognised. Cú Chulainn didn't. He asked her for milk. She gave it to him, 3 times from 3 separate offerings, and each time he drank he did what any well-raised warrior would do for a stranger's kindness. He blessed her. A blessing on you, old mother, or some close variant of it, spoken without a second thought. Each blessing closed a wound. By the 3rd drink, the old woman standing in front of him was, invisibly, whole again, healed by the exact hands that had broken her, because he had done it without knowing who she was, and a blessing given honestly cannot be taken back once it's landed. When the truth surfaced, when she finally let him understand who he'd just healed, his response, in the version of the tale that survives, is almost sheepish. Had he known, he tells her, he never would have blessed her at all. Her answer amounts to this. Of course you wouldn't have. That's rather the point. Sit with what actually just happened, because it's stranger and more interesting than Goddess gets revenge. A figure with every reason to want this man dead, who had just spent an entire day trying to kill him in 3 different bodies, chose instead to seek him out, disguise herself as someone harmless, and manipulate him into healing her using nothing but his own decency. Not force, not another attack. She needed something from the man she'd been fighting, and the only way to get it was to let him be kind to a stranger. That is not the behaviour of a simple war goddess settling a score. That's a figure operating on a logic closer to fate, or reciprocity, or sovereignty itself. The idea, deeply embedded in how Irish myth thinks about power, that a ruler's or a hero's worth gets tested precisely at the moments they don't know they're being tested. Cú Chulainn passed a test he never knew he was taking. He just thought he was being polite to an old woman. He's not alone in that. This exact shape, an unlovely old woman at the edge of the road, quietly deciding whether the man in front of her deserves what she's guarding, recurs across Irish tradition, often enough that scholars treat it as a pattern in its own right, not a coincidence. In one of the most famous versions, the young Prince Neil and his brothers go hunting and grow thirsty, and find a well guarded by a hag so foul that each brother in turn refuses to kiss her in exchange for water, and rides off unsatisfied. Only Neil agrees, and the moment he does, the hag transforms into the most beautiful woman any of them have ever seen. She tells him plainly what she is, the sovereignty of Ireland itself, foul to those unworthy of ruling, fair to the one who proves he can see past the surface to what's actually being offered. Neil becomes High King. His brothers, who wouldn't kiss an ugly stranger for a cup of water, do not. Cú Chulainn's old woman isn't that story exactly. Nobody transforms into anything beautiful, and what's being tested is decency rather than desire. But it's built from the same conviction, that the land, or fate, or sovereignty itself likes to show up disguised as something easy to dismiss, and quietly keep score of who dismisses it anyway. A hero who'd refused her outright at the ford earlier in this same story nonetheless passed the second, quieter test without even realising one had been set. That's the kind of detail that gets lost the moment you flatten someone down to war goddess. War goddesses don't usually bother testing anyone's character, they just fight. Step back from Cú Chulainn for a moment, because focusing on their story alone gives you exactly the flattened version this video is trying to correct. One very famous relationship standing in for an entire figure. The oldest and richest source for who she actually was isn't the Cú Chulainn material at all. It's a text called Ca Mwy Yw Tuatha Dé, the Battle of Mag Tuired, which tells the story of the Tuatha Dé Danann's war against a race called the Fomorians for control of Ireland itself. And in that story, she isn't a battlefield nuisance harassing one hero. She's a strategist standing at the centre of the entire war effort. The clearest scene comes at a river ford. Fords recur constantly around her, which is its own kind of clue, on the eve of Samhain, where she meets the Dagda, one of the Tuatha Dé's most powerful figures, washing herself in the water. What follows is a deliberate union between the two of them, and immediately afterward she gives him something more useful than affection: intelligence, where the enemy is gathered, what she intends to do to help secure the coming battle. The text doesn't frame this as seduction, it frames it as alliance-making between equals, at exactly the turning point in the calendar year the Irish considered most dangerous and most liminal, the night the boundary between worlds went thin. When the battle itself comes, she doesn't stand at the back directing from safety. She speaks, 3 times, in a highly formalised style of chant called rosk, a form of poetry so charged in Irish tradition it was treated less like art and more like a weapon in its own right. The first poem incites the army to fight. The second, once the battle is won, declares peace and blesses the land into balance. The third looks further out than anyone else in the story bothers to look. A prophecy of what's still coming, long after this particular war is forgotten, framed in language of decline and eventual ruin. That's not a war goddess in the sense the phrase usually implies, someone who simply enjoys or embodies violence. That's a figure managing the entire arc of a conflict, inciting it, ending it, and then naming what happens after everyone else has stopped paying attention. Prophecy, strategy, the formal right to speak peace into existence once the fighting stops. In the deeper structure of Irish myth, this kind of figure is frequently bound up with sovereignty itself, the idea that the land has to consent through a goddess who represents it before any king can legitimately rule it. Meeting her at a ford, joining with her, receiving her blessing, this is the vocabulary Irish myth uses for earning the right to a throne. She's not incidental to power in these stories. She's one of the mechanisms by which power becomes legitimate at all. That idea has a physical address if you know where to look. On the border of counties Cork and Kerry, 2 rounded hills rise from the landscape in a shape no one who sees them fails to notice. Twin peaks, each crowned with an ancient stone cairn positioned with obvious deliberateness. They are called in English the Paps of Anu, named for one of the alternate names this figure carries in the oldest genealogies. Whether or not the identification is precise, and this is folklore layered onto landscape across a very long span of time, not a signed deed, people have been looking at those 2 hills for centuries and seeing a goddess of the land made visible in the land itself. You do not need to squint. The shape is exactly what the name implies, and it has been sitting on the Cork-Kerry border the entire time, long before anyone made a documentary about who used to be worshipped there. Even her own name carries an argument scholars haven't finished having. Morrígan is usually translated as Great Queen. Mor, meaning great. Riogan, meaning queen. A straightforward title befitting everything Part 4 has just described. But a second reading has real linguistic support too, built on an older root, Mor or Mora, connected to terror, to nightmare, to the same ancient word family that eventually gives English the word mare in nightmare itself. The crushing, suffocating presence that sits on a sleeper's chest in the dark. Under that reading, her name isn't Great Queen at all. It's closer to Phantom Queen, or Queen of Terrors. Nobody has definitively settled which reading is correct, and it's entirely possible both meanings were felt at once by the people who first used the name, the way a single word can carry weight and dread in the same breath. Either translation fits everything you've just heard about her. That, on its own, tells you something. Here's where this video has to be honest about something most retellings quietly paper over. Nobody actually agrees on how many of her there are. The name most people know, Morrigan, sometimes refers to a single figure, but it's also used across different manuscripts as a kind of umbrella title for a trio, Badb, Macha, and a third figure who is sometimes called Nemain and sometimes called Nand, depending entirely on which medieval scribe was copying which version of which text down. One of the oldest sources, the Livre Gavahla Aren, the Book of Invasions, flatly lists Badb, Macha, and a third sister named Morrigan as three daughters of the same mother, not aspects of one goddess. Three individuals related by blood, each with her own name and her own stories, and yet other texts use Morrigan as though it was simply a job title, applied almost interchangeably to whichever of the sisters happens to be doing the goddess of battle work in that particular scene. Badb turns up independently, and her signature moment has nothing to do with Cú Chulainn at all. On the eve of a great battle, she and her sister Nemain rise over the field by night and simply scream. Not a spell, not a weapon in any conventional sense, just two voices pitched at something past what a human throat should be able to produce, and the sound alone is enough to kill. 100 men, by the account that survives, die of fright before a single blow is exchanged, the terror of the sound itself doing a battle's worth of damage before the actual fighting has even started. It is one of the strangest weapons in all of Irish myth. Not strength, not magic in the usual sense, just a shriek engineered to be unsurvivable. And it belongs to Badb alone, independent of any hero, any romance, any story where she needs a man to react to her at all. Macha has an entire mythology of her own, and it's worth telling in full because it's the curse that opened this video's very first chapter without naming its source. Macha, in one of the tradition's harder stories, was married to a farmer named Cruinniuc, and heavily pregnant when her husband, boasting at the king's court, unable to help himself, claimed his wife could outrun the king's fastest horses. The king, offended and curious in equal measure, demanded proof on the spot, threatening Cruinniuc's life if he refused. Macha begged for mercy, pleading her condition, warning that the exertion could kill her or the child. The court forced her to run anyway. She won. She beat the horses, collapsed at the finish line, and gave birth to twins in front of the entire assembled court, and then, in her pain and fury, laid a curse on every man of Ulster present that day. At the moment their province needed them most, they would be struck down with the pangs of her own childbirth, helpless for as long as a woman in labour for 9 generations to come. That is the curse this video's cold open glossed over without naming. The reason Ulster's grown warriors lay incapacitated while a teenage boy held an entire invading army alone at a river ford. Macha's private humiliation became Ulster's public catastrophe, inherited by men who had nothing to do with the court that forced her to run, which is either deeply unjust or exactly the kind of consequence Irish myth thought a broken obligation to a goddess deserved. Beyond the curse, her name marks Evie in Macha, one of the most important royal sites in the entire Ulster Cycle, and the old texts remember the heads taken in battle grimly as Macha's acorn crop, a harvest metaphor for something considerably darker than grain. Modern retellings, especially the more devotional ones, love to smooth this into a tidy maiden mother-crone triple goddess, the kind of structure that feels satisfying and complete. Scholars who work directly with the surviving Irish texts are, by and large, considerably less sure. The honest answer is that the manuscripts disagree with each other, possibly because different regions of pre-Christian Ireland worshipped what were once genuinely separate, local goddesses who got folded together imperfectly, once the stories were finally written down by Christian scribes centuries after the tradition was still a living practice. What survived in ink isn't one settled picture. It's several competing memories of something the writers themselves may not have fully understood by the time they were recording it. That uncertainty isn't a flaw in the source material. It's evidence of how much was already being lost by the time anyone thought to write any of it down at all. And it's a far more honest place to leave this than the confident simplified triple goddess chart you'll find on most single-page summaries. So here is a figure who negotiates alliances with one of the most powerful gods in the Irish pantheon on the single most dangerous night of the calendar year, who commands a form of poetry treated as literal magic, who ends a war by speaking peace into existence, and then tells everyone, unprompted, how it all eventually falls apart. who is bound up at the deepest structural level of Irish myth with what makes a king a legitimate king at all, who tests the greatest hero of an entire cycle of legend not with brute force, but with an elaborate, patient piece of theatre involving an eel, a wolf, a heifer, an old woman, and 3 cups of milk, and who is there one final time at the exact moment his story ends to confirm to the world that he's gone. And what actually made it into general cultural memory is War Goddess. Sometimes Scary Crow Lady. Walk through how she shows up now, outside of anyone who's actually gone looking for the old texts. Video games slot her in as a combat class unit or a boss fight, usually reskinned as generic dark magic with wings. A stat block with a raven motif. No Ford, no milk, no 40-year-old grudge with a hero who never learned her name until it no longer mattered. Television shows use her as a stock old god losing relevance in the modern world, which is at least an accidentally accurate joke, considering what's actually happened to her. She turns up in comics and urban fantasy almost exclusively as a villain or an antagonist faction, the default setting for anything Celtic and vaguely threatening that a writer needs without doing further research. Interchangeable in these appearances with any other dark goddess a genre needs on short notice, stripped of the one thing that made her specific in the first place. A story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, running through the life of one particular man. None of it is malicious. Most of it probably comes from a single second-hand summary, copied forward through a few decades of fantasy media, each version a little further from a Ford at Samhain, and a promise made to a hero who never learned her name until it was too late to matter. This is the exact machinery this channel keeps finding, video after video, and it's worth naming plainly here rather than just implying it. Demotion doesn't require an enemy. Nobody had to conspire to erase her. It happens by default through simplification, through centuries of retellers each keeping the most legible, most marketable piece of a figure and letting the rest quietly drop away. A crow is easy to draw. A goddess who tests kings through the precise mechanics of Iron Age poetic lore is not. Back to the standing stone. A dying man refusing to fall. A crow landing when no one else dared to get close. Their story had already been running for years by that point, and neither one of them had forgotten how it started. An offer, made at a ford to a hero too proud and too pressed for time to accept help from a stranger. A refusal. 3 wounds, delivered without either of them fully seeing the other's face. A trick played with 3 cups of milk, healing what he'd broken without either of them naming what was really happening. And now, finally, an ending. Not vengeance, not triumph, just presence. She was there when it began. She made sure to be there when it ended. That's not what a war goddess does. That's not even really what a villain does. That's closer to what a fate does. The kind of figure Irish tradition understood as woven into a hero's story from its first thread to its last, whether he ever accepted her or not. She prophesied wars and then told the winning side, unprompted, how their victory would eventually curdle into something worse. She met a god at a river the night the world went thin, and what came out of that meeting wasn't romance. It was strategy that helped win a war. She cursed an entire province through one of her sisters over an injustice done to a pregnant woman forced to run against horses, and that curse quietly shaped which single teenager ended up alone at a ford holding off an army. She is remembered, depending entirely on which scribe you're reading, as one goddess or as 3 sisters who occasionally did each other's jobs, and honestly, nobody who actually studies the text will pretend to have settled which. Even her own name won't sit still. Great Queen, or Phantom Queen, depending on which route you trust, as if the people who first spoke it couldn't decide either, or didn't need to. What every version agrees on is this. Whatever she was, she mattered enormously to how Irish myth thought about kingship, about fate, about who gets to rule and why, and about what it costs a hero to reject help from someone he should have taken seriously. What survived into the present day, on the wikis and the character sheets and the trailers for movies that get her wrong, is a crow. Just a crow, ominous and simple, doing exactly one job, showing up right before something dies. Easy to draw, easy to license, easy to forget was ever anything more. She was never just that. She was the one who decided when it was safe to say so,